I'm an artist who thinks about cities. And when I think about cities, it's not just the physical infrastructure or the social infrastructure. I also think about the social conditions, the social codes by which we live and share space. And I also think about the laws and the regulations, and taking all of these together to look at a full portrait of what a city is. To my mind, it's an extremely interesting time to be looking at public space, urban public space in the context of a city. And that's because it's changing very rapidly because of technology. The technologies available now are mediating a lot of the traditional roles public space has served in the broader context of the city. And to get a sense of what we mean when we talk about the traditional roles of urban public space, we can trace all the way back to the Greek theory of the Agora. Now, the Agora, which means gathering place in Greek, was a community market. It was a gathering place for socializing and for art making and for political organizing as well. It was the center of public life in the Greek city-state. Now, if you think of a lot of these traditional roles have since been supplanted by technology, mobile technology, websites that allow you to purchase and communicate and join some sort of sense of a community online without actually having to be in public space, without actually having to be anywhere. So then that brings up this question for us: what is public space for? In the range of the contemporary city, what do we need it for if all of these other attributes have been taken over by technology? Of course, we still value face-to-face connections, and this is borne out by farmers markets and local food movements. And of course, we all have our favorite local cafes that we attend. So I've been coming to think of the relationship between technology and urban public space a little bit like the relationship between photography and the discipline of painting. When the technology of photography developed, it had a very, very interesting effect on painting. Now, of course, there's a very complex relationship back and forth over time between photography and painting. But one thing you can say is that photography freed painting from its need to create figurative or representational expressions of the real world. And that allowed us to explore new ways of seeing and new manners of representation, new visual theories like surrealism, abstractionism. And so I would argue that current technology is actually having a similar effect on our urban public spaces. When urban public space as a medium is decoupled from its traditional role in civic life, maybe it's free to roam into areas of abstraction and surrealism, and it's now freed up from its traditional role and has become an experimental ground. So if this is true, then how would you reimagine your city? What would you like your city to be? Well, there's been a number of conferences all over the world, and for some reason a lot of them seem to be called urban play, that look at small-scale urban interventions that explore the full range of potential for what a city could be. A city could be a playground, a place for informal social gatherings, a crucible for possibility and exploration. And then, of course, there's smart city conferences which take technology and apply it to some of the really pressing issues of the day. But that technology is also used to make art that engages the city. Now, cities evolve. They're always changing, but they evolve slowly. And so in some regard, the city that we inhabit today is a relic of the past. In its physical form, the cities express the values and the priorities of past generations. Now, of course, history and a relical sense of your city is wonderful. No one would want to live in Vienna without its historical buildings. But I'm talking more about the ways in which we revise city systems. So in San Francisco, where I come from, in 1959, the Department of City Planning built a huge freeway called the Embarcadero Freeway that essentially cut off the historic waterfront and wharf from the rest of the city. It was damaged very severely in the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 and had to be torn down. But it would never be built today. It's an out-of-date value system and out-of-date priorities that led them to build this freeway right across the front of the city. If you were to propose this now to a city like San Francisco, I think you'd probably be laughed out of the room. And so now there exists there a tree-lined boulevard with wide sidewalks and bike lanes and a whole range of cultural amenities for you to enjoy. Now, there's also some intentional deconstructions of freeways happening in the United States right now, too. As cities move to reprioritize, make our cities more sustainable, and really try to reflect contemporary values about how urban space should be used. But it's important to remember that this physical transformation, these physical revisions to the city, occur much slower than cultural evolution. The rate of cultural evolution is so much faster than the rate of the physical revision of the city that the city could never hope to keep up. So then how would we go about making our city a place that expresses our contemporary selves and expresses our contemporary values? What are we to do? And how do we make our city adaptable as those values and those priorities continue to change over time? Our city needs to be nimble, it needs to be adaptive, and it needs to be resilient. So the work that I've done with Rebar and then more recently with MoreLab looks at the materials of the city as well as the social structures and the regulations of the city. But pieces that look at the physical structures of the city take these easily recognizable materials, actually iconic materials that we think of when we think of city furniture and whatnot. And we reposition these materials and these objects as a way to generate new forms of meaning. We also like to take everyday materials, recognizable materials like railroad track, and do impossible seeming things with it. One project we did that really explored the physical and the spatial and the social dynamics of public space was called Common Space. And Common Space explored San Francisco's privately owned public spaces. I'll say that again, privately owned public space. That doesn't seem to make sense, does it? But in exchange for providing a private public space in the building, a developer is allowed to build their building a little bit taller, a little bit wider. And some of these privately owned public spaces look a bit like a traditional plaza. This one's a roof garden. Some of them don't look anything like what you would think of as a traditional public space. Pretty much all of them, you have to go past a guard station or up an elevator, so access is relatively limited. And every single one of them is under constant private surveillance. So, to explore these projects, to explore these spaces, we created a year-long project of urban interventions, all the way from the spontaneous, like kite flying, to much more organized, like the nappening, which was a free nap event, open to the public. And every single cot for every single shift we had was filled with an overworked and tired office worker that was coming down from one of the law firms in the building and taking a well-deserved break. But the goal of this project, and really the core underlying exploration we were going for, was public. How public are these spaces? When you have a space that is fully enclosed by private capital, but is somehow open to the public and available to the public, it may or may not have all of the cues that we think of when we see public space. How public really is that space? And one project that we did that really explored the entire city as an artistic medium in all of those forms, infrastructures, rules, codes, laws, had a really dramatic effect on the way cities are made. This project was called Parking, and we did it in 2005. And essentially, it is a temporary public park in a metered parking space. We paid the parking meter for 2 hours, which was the terms of the lease offered by the city for the space. And we rolled out the traditional symbols of an urban public park: some living grass, a bench, and a tree. We put up a sign that said "Public Park, please put a quarter in the meter." And then we receded into the background to see what happened. Yeah, so the idea, the sort of legal theory behind this was the city is offering this space for lease. And you can put a car there, but perhaps you can do other things with this space as long as you're paying the rent, right? As long as you're paying for the space. And it turns out in researching the regulations of San Francisco, that's true. Probably because they didn't write the laws as tightly as they wanted to. But for whatever reason, there was this glaring legal loophole that we walked through in creating this project. Now, the site where we did it is hard to see here, so I put a giant blue arrow so you can see where our one little parking space was. But it was in an area of downtown San Francisco that the Department of City Planning had identified as lacking green space. That area is here in the gray shaded areas. This is 2005. They had this map. We had this map when we selected our site. And at that time, they had no plans to solve this problem. No public parks were planned. Well, I'm happy to report that now there is a public park planned for there. It's going to be a roof garden at the new Transbay terminal. It's going to be quite lovely, actually. It's going to be elevated 2 stories off the ground. It's going to be a roof park. And it's going to open in 2017. So they had identified this problem in 2005, and finally are going to be solving it in 2017. So again, thinking back at the rate at which our city changes, the rate at which it can identify a community need, it can identify an issue or a problem with the city, and then address that problem. 12 years to pick a park. Anyway, when we did this project, we put some images up online, and we apparently hit a nerve with folks all over the globe. And people began asking us to come to their city and replicate the project. And the truth of the matter is, it took a couple of beers and about $200 and some email to pull it off. So instead of flying around the world to do it, we created this how-to manual and decided we'd let the project become an open source project. Anyone could participate, as long as it wasn't used for commercial purposes. And in 2006, to harness all of this interest, we created Parking Day, which is a one-day annual event that takes place on the 3rd Friday in September. And it happens all over the world because people in cities all over the world are facing the same set of problems: automobile congestion, a lack of green space, a lack of opportunities to just sit and informally socialize with people or make new friends. So it became a platform for exploring critical questions around how our urban public space is used, and a way to promote dialogue and propose some new possibilities for how our spaces could be used. We stopped counting Parking Day. We got tired of it. It became a difficult undertaking, and frankly, too many people in the news media only wanted to hear the raw numbers. They weren't that interested in the messages or the projects, the quality of the interventions. They just wanted to know the quantity. So we stopped counting in 2011. But as you can see, it's a pretty sizable project at that time. Almost 1,000 parks, 162 cities, 35 countries, on all 6 permanently inhabited continents, except Antarctica. Now, this is where the story gets sort of interesting to me, because some very inspired and forward-thinking city planners in San Francisco looked at Parking Day and said, this is great. The idea of having a small public plaza in a metered parking space. How could we develop that into an official city program? How could we create a regulatory pathway that people can use to create these kinds of spaces right in front of their building? In 2010, the city of San Francisco created a pilot program for this. And so here are this is one of the parklets that we built in front of a cafe in North Beach in San Francisco. And so an organization, a cafe, a restaurant, or an individual, in one case in San Francisco, will sponsor the parklet and pay for its creation and pay for its upkeep. But they're open to the public. You do not need to be a patron of the businesses there in order to hang out in it. And parklets became this great new phenomenon in the United States and eventually around the world as well. So the Department of City Planning had to make their own manual, just like we made our parking day manual. They made the parklet manual in order to address this interest from people who wanted to do this in their own areas. And so here is a map similar in some ways to the parking day map. This is the parklet map. This represents projects, parklets, and other temporary plazas and programs, official programs all over the world, where the story kind of folds back on itself. In 2012, we had an urban prototyping festival in San Francisco, and the Mayor's Office of Civic Innovation was a key collaborator and a curator of this project, looking for new permit ideas, new projects that could be evolved into permits. There's going to be another urban prototyping festival focusing on Market Street, and artists are really called to the table as a central collaborator in reimagining what the city could be. This is a new role for artists, and we should all be giving support for this, whether we live in San Francisco or Singapore or Venice or Vienna. Technology has opened up this gap, and artists have stepped into the breach. It creates an extraordinary opportunity for everyone, but everybody must do their part. So I would say to the artists and the museum people and curators, cultural institutions, the city is a medium. Make and curate and promote work that is innovative, responsible, inclusive, and done with a sense of civic pride. To the civic agencies, I would say the city is a collaboration. Support these projects, figure out how to do them, or just step out of the way and let them happen. Central problems in cities don't always have central solutions. You may find that the solution to some of our big problems are bottom up, and that they're flexible and resilient and responsive and distributed. And to the urban inhabitants, I'd say the city is yours. It's more than something you passively receive. Take part, take action, make yourself heard, because you are expert users at the city. And the medium is, in fact, the metropolis. Artists, civic agencies, and everyday people working together and each doing their part can elevate our cities into truly magnificent works of art. Thank you.